Now, we've had all the hype of the Rugby World Cup this year, and for most of us we've had time to calm down and get back into a neutral state of affairs. So I thought it was a good time to make a video and have a look at the global state of rugby as it stands today across the world. And I'm going to rely a lot on you for your feedback on this, because you can tell me how rugby's going in your particular country. But for the sake of this video, I thought I'd split it up into three different segments. Let's have a look at the good, the bad and the ugly right here in this video. Hello and welcome to Inside Rugby. If you haven't been here before, my name is Mark. I'm a Kiwi rugby fan living in beautiful Cancun in Mexico. And what I do is I just make videos about all sorts of different things going on in the world of rugby. So I'd love you to stick around. And if you're a regular viewer, welcome back. It's always great to have you guys and girls here. I thought we'd talk about the global state of rugby around the world. And I say we because I really want to know from you what's going on in your particular country when it comes to rugby. There's been a lot of discussion online about the state of rugby across the world, and in particular how World Rugby are managing that. I want to try to drill down a little bit more and get into the facts and details so that we're just not making assumptions. So if you can tell me a little bit about the state of rugby in your country or even your town, that would be really, really fantastic. And we're going to start off with, of course, the good list. And we can't go past this year's Rugby World Cup. What a fantastic tournament it was for all sorts of different reasons. We saw some amazing games and some incredible players that you may not have seen in the past. Now, if you look beyond the draw, and we've talked about that one to death, so I don't think we need to go into that anymore. But I think if you look beyond the draw, we saw some magnificent games of rugbies, and not just from those favoured teams either. I think some of the tier 2 nations, as we call them, really gave us some highlights. And I don't think I'm ever going to forget that game between Fiji and Portugal. That was a fantastic game, as was the Portugal game against Georgia. That was another one that really stuck out for me in this year's Rugby World Cup. So I think it was a fantastic tournament this year, the Rugby World Cup. It gave us a lot of excitement both on and off the field. And I've been wondering just how well it actually did from a statistical, numerical point of view. So I've dived into the numbers, and this is what I found out. Now, the total viewing numbers that have come out for this year's Rugby World Cup is 1.1 billion views. So that's quite an incredible number when you consider it's 1/8 of the planet's population. So I think World Rugby would have been fairly happy with those numbers. But then if we drill down a little bit further, we'll see some of the other statistics that I think are quite interesting and also important when it comes to assessing the global state of rugby. Now, let's start off with the French audience, because obviously the Rugby World Cup was in France this year, and it was interesting to see how the French got behind the tournament itself. Now, across France, they had all the villages set up, of course, at each of the stadiums, and a lot of people got along to those villages to watch the game, in addition to those that actually got into the stadiums. And it's now been reported that 1.16 million people in France visited those villages throughout the Rugby World Cup. So that was a pretty good number indeed. Another number that's come out of France is the viewership on television for the entire tournament, and 164 million people in France tuned in to the Cup this year. So pretty good audiences, and yes, that is up on the numbers that were in Japan for the 2019 Rugby World Cup. Now, if we have a look at social media, World Rugby says that 1.8 million new followers of the game came online during the Rugby World Cup, and a very interesting statistic of that was that 1/3 of those were Spanish-speaking people. So the global Spanish-speaking community starting to get really interested in the sport of rugby. So that was really interesting to see. Now, in the UK, we had ITV doing a lot of the television coverage, and they had 8.7 million viewers for that game between England and South Africa. So they were record numbers for ITV in the UK. Now, if we look in New Zealand, 2.5 million Kiwis tuned into the tournament in total, just over 1 million for the final between South Africa and New Zealand. Considering New Zealand's population is just a little over 5 million, that's a pretty good number. There was also a lot of viewers in New Zealand looking at the Maori language television who broadcasted the games as well, and record numbers of viewers were tuning into that, so that was really good in New Zealand. Now, looking at some of the money and financial side of the tournament this year, to actually get a sponsorship package, the average cost of a sponsorship package for companies at this year's Rugby World Cup was $3.7 million. The top sponsorship deals, they were worth $7 million for this year's Rugby World Cup. There was quite a few sponsorship deals that were done for 1 year, and those deals cost around about $2 million. So quite a significant amount of money coming in for World Rugby through the tournament this year. So those were the monies coming in from this year's Rugby World Cup, and if we look at the monies going out, the South African team won $5.9 million for winning that final against New Zealand, and New Zealand, the runners-up, got $3.1 million for their coffers. So quite a good financial windfall as well for both teams, really, when you think about it. Now, what if your team didn't get out of the pool stages this year at the Rugby World Cup? Well, they went home with an average of $306,000. So a huge difference there, of course, and that's one of the things that I'm going to talk a little bit more about in this particular video. So I think the Rugby World Cup was a huge success for a number of reasons. There's no doubt there's a few things that need to be fixed, and I'm going to talk about those in the bad and the ugly segments of this particular video. But overall, I watched every single match of the Rugby World Cup this year. I thought there was obviously some matches that were a little bit less interesting than others, but boy, did those quarterfinals really give us some exciting rugby right across the field. And it was really interesting, I think, as we got to the later stages of the tournament, because it became obvious that we had really 4 nations, and perhaps England as well, who are really, really close in the pecking order when it comes to rugby at the moment. And I think what France and South Africa and Ireland and New Zealand, and I throw England in there as well at the end, really did for this year's Rugby World Cup were really, really exciting. And as we even built up for this year's tournament, there was a lot of hype around, and I guess also speculation around what was going to happen in this year's Rugby World Cup, because we just didn't know. And now in hindsight, we can go back and look at some of those games and we can say, yeah, they could have gone either way in those quarterfinals, and we could have ended up with a very different result. And I think that's what we're all looking for from rugby at a Rugby World Cup. We're looking for good competition. We're looking at uncertainty in terms of who can lift the cup, because I think that brings the excitement that is also very, very special in professional sport. Now, another thing that really excited me throughout this year's Rugby World Cup is a whole host of new young players coming through. And I think that's fantastic for the game. And of course, the Rugby World Cup gives them the platform to really, really show themselves. And, you know, people like the French wingers, Damien Penaud and Louis Barret were absolutely fantastic. 2 young guys who are really going to show themselves on the world stage. And we've got people like Mani Lebok in South Africa, and we've got Kanan Moody also in South Africa. Young guys that are really stepping up on the world scene now, and over the next 4 years, they're going to be superstars in the world of rugby. And there's a host of other players as well. Why don't you drop me those young players that you really enjoyed watching at this year's Rugby World Cup, because I'm sure they're going to be superstars in the future for rugby as a sport across the world, whether it be at international level or where it be in the domestic level competitions as well. Now, another good thing that came out of the Rugby World Cup for me was the participation from the spectators. I think it was absolutely fantastic. We saw the Green Army, of course, doing a lot of singing for Ireland during their pool stages, and at the quarter-final stage, it was absolutely fantastic to see. But I think it was great to see full stadiums for all of the games, or pretty much all of the games. And that just shows not only the strength of rugby across the world at this stage, but it also showed the festivity of a tournament like the Rugby World Cup. And I think this is something that World Rugby needs to look at, because do we have to wait every 4 years until we see this kind of spectacle where we see full stadiums on a regular basis and the top teams playing against each other and the tier 2 teams getting an opportunity to play against the top teams? I don't know, but I think this is one of the things that really came to life for me, was the participation from the spectators. I loved the singing, I loved the camaraderie. And if you looked at a lot of the videos after the games as well, you saw a lot of the spectators getting together, having a drink together, and just sharing in a wonderful time. And I think that was really, really fantastic for the sport of rugby, and a great advertisement for France as well, because they did a fantastic job at hosting this tournament. I think it was absolutely brilliant. Of course, we had super hot weather at the beginning of the tournament, and we had those drink breaks coming into the game, and it really gave it a summer type festival atmosphere, didn't it, across all the locations that we saw in France. I just think it was a really superbly run tournament. Now, another good thing that's happening in global rugby at the moment, as far as I'm concerned, is the growth of women's rugby in the sport across the world. And we've only had to look back last year to the Women's World Cup in New Zealand. It was a fantastic tournament, and what a final it was between England and New Zealand. It was absolutely brilliant. But as I've watched rugby over the last 12 months, and I've actually gone and seen in some countries what's happening to the game, I'm seeing the growth of women's rugby. I'm seeing it also in terms of the growth of the support of women's rugby, and that's absolutely important as well. So we're seeing sponsors coming on board, we're seeing more broadcasters coming on board and giving women the correct amount of coverage that they deserve. And of course they deserve more, but we're starting to see the state of women's rugby grow online, and that's a really fantastic thing. We're also seeing the profile of some of those players becoming more and more famous for women as role models across the world, and young girls to get into the game. So I think the state of women's rugby is pretty good. I think it's growing really well, and I think that's a good thing that's happening in world rugby. But as I get on to some of the bad things, I'll talk about how it perhaps could be a little bit better. Now, if you know anything about the state of women's rugby in your country, let me know in the comments. I'm really interested to find out whether what I'm seeing is something that is a general trend across the world of rugby. Of course, we've got some big playing nations as far as women's rugby goes at the moment. Is it happening in smaller countries? I'd like to know from you in the comments if you've got any visibility on that. It'd be really interesting. I'd also like to know the state of young rugby, under 20s, under 16s, and of course kids rugby in your country. So if you've got some personal connection to that, let me know what's going on in your country, because I really want to create a barometer on what's happening in the state of world rugby today. And for that, I'm going to have to rely on you a lot too, my viewers. So let's see what we can create in terms of a knowledge base on really the true state of rugby across the world today. I'd be really interested to find out from you. Okay, moving on to some of the things that I think is bad in the state of world rugby at the moment. I don't want to focus on bad as the word per se. Let's say things that need addressing or a little bit more work needs to go into. And the top of my list for this one is the TMO situation. And I think we'll all agree that this process is a work in progress, and there needs to be some more work. So both as players and coaches get used to the system and what the TMO is looking for, and the referees and their synergy and interaction with the TMO, I think that's something that needs to be given a little bit more time to work out. One of the things that I think is bad is the TMO injecting themselves too much into the game. That's something I saw throughout the World Cup that didn't impress me too much, and I think that's bad for the state of rugby. Let me know. So yeah, work in progress for the TMO, and I'd like to see some consistency come into that. That's all we're looking for, is consistency when it comes to TMO. We can't have the TMO in one game really injecting themselves in the game, and then in the next game we hardly hear from the TMO. And that's probably the way we want to go, is we don't want to hear too much from the TMO. So let me know what you think in the comments. Do you think the TMOs are injecting themselves too much in the game at the moment? Okay, moving on my list of things that I think are bad or need improving in the state of global rugby at the moment. And the next one is finances. And I'm sure many people who are watching this video could make a comment about the state of club finances in your particular town, city or area. And it's in a really bad state, and something needs to be done about this, of course. Now, if you haven't watched the video I did recently with an interview with Scott van Breda, he's a South African rugby player who's played his rugby in the UK recently, and played for two clubs that financially went under, and he ended up without a job. And I think this is one of the terrible things that's happening in global rugby at the moment. We've just got a lack of investment coming in at the club level, and it's such an important part of our game, because these clubs are social centres as part of the communities that they're based in. And of course, a lot of these players are relying on the income coming from their clubs to keep their living and lifestyle that they have. And these guys aren't millionaires by any chance of the imagination. So we've got to look at what's happening at club level. We've got to look at the business model. And I spent some time earlier this year going through England and Wales. I looked particularly at the club business model scene, And what I saw was pretty disheartening, because a lot of these clubs are not run very effectively. If you go into a rugby club, a lot of the club incomes at the local level are derived from the bar situation. We've got players and their families going in there, a community, drinking a lot of beer, paying a lot of money, and that's helping these clubs survive. And I think that's wrong from a number of different perspectives when it comes to a club's finances. So we've got to look at better ways in which we run rugby clubs around the world. The way that sponsors come in and the opportunities that they get, and the way the local community supports a rugby club as well. Anybody that relies on a base of volunteers to be successful over the long term, in my opinion, is not going to be successful. Volunteers are wonderful people, and they've kept rugby clubs going for too long. We need to look at new models in which we can create sustainability in the sport of rugby, and I think a lot of that comes back to the local rugby federations and also World Rugby and how some of that money is being distributed. So one of the things that I think we need to improve in the game globally is the way that we run clubs in a financial sense and the business model that they run, and that's something that I would like to see improved over the short term and medium term. Let me know how your rugby club is doing in your local area. What have been some of the challenges that you're facing in your local community? I'd really like to hear from you, so please drop a comment on that below this video. Okay, the next thing that's a bad thing on my list of the state of rugby around the world at the moment is mental health. And again, I spent some time earlier this year when my trip through England and Wales, visiting a lot of rugby clubs, talking to lots of players, officials and coaches, and there's a mental health epidemic within the world of rugby at the moment. A lot of people are suffering, and it's quite a challenging situation. In fact, in the time that I was in the UK, 4 rugby players took their own lives because of the stress they were under in their lives. And it goes hand in hand with what I was just talking about with finances at rugby clubs, because if rugby players find themselves out of a contract or their club goes into bankruptcy, they're left without a job, they're left without employment, they're left without income coming in. And this puts a huge stress on them emotionally, and the whole family has to deal with that, and it's creating a lot of mental stress. The other thing that causes a lot of mental stress in rugby is also injuries, and we're seeing more and more players getting long-term injuries now. If a player gets an ACL, they're out for a number of months, and when they're not playing, they're not earning the types of income that they could be or should be, and this puts a lot of emotional stress on the player and their family as well. And I'm mentioning families a lot here because, as we all know, rugby is about the community, it's about the family. And we've got a rugby player going off and playing their games in the weekend, and they're being supported by their husband or their wife, and it's a very, very important thing in our community. So we need to do more around mental health. World Rugby needs to do more around mental health. It's great that they're putting a lot of emphasis into the tackle law at the moment and head injuries and all the rest of it, but what's going on inside the head of rugby players, of rugby officials and rugby administrators around the world, for me, is just as an important topic to focus on for World Rugby, the federations at a local level, and also our local rugby clubs. So mental health is something that's bad at the moment within the sport of rugby as far as I'm concerned, and I'm aware of and I've had experience with, and I'd love to know more from you about your local area. Do you think mental health is a big issue within your rugby community? Next up on my list of things that are bad or need improving in the state of World Rugby at the moment is coaching development. It's great that we see Rassie and Jacques Nienaber and Ian Foster and all these guys at the Rugby World Cup, but if you go down a couple of levels, the support for coaches is very, very poor, and more needs to be done to support coaches. Let's face it, they play a very important part in our game, and a lot of them are volunteers and help out for many, many years. And I think this is another thing that needs to change within the business model of coaches across the world of rugby. We also need to see better pathways for coaches' personal development, and not enough of that is happening in World Rugby today. And if a coach comes into the system, they should be given a pathway on where they can go with their coaching as a career if they choose to do that, and we don't see enough of that. So I think World Rugby, again, from the very top down to local federations at a national level, and then again at a local level in towns and cities, we need to see better coordination of coaches' pathway towards development, so coaches are supported more. And also at a personal development level, I've spoken to a lot of coaches around the world. They don't get enough training. They're not up to speed with all the latest when it comes to injury rehabilitation and all the other things that they need to focus on. And they're hungry and they're wanting more from a coaching development point of view. So not enough of that is happening. It's happening a lot at the high performance level, at the professional international level, but it hasn't trickled down enough into the local game. And I think that's very, very important. If we want to grow the game around the world, we need to make sure there's a healthy inventory of coaches who feel they're getting supported and that there's an adequate career path for them in the game of rugby. And that's something that I would like to see improved in the sport of rugby. Let me know what you think. If you're a coach out there in the rugby world at the moment, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What's your perspective? Do you think I'm talking things that are relevant, or do you think I'm talking through a hole in my head? Let me know. I'd love to know in the comments. Okay, next up on my list of bad things, or things that need to be improved in the state of rugby across the world at the moment, is simply the scrums. And we've got to decide what we want as far as scrums in rugby. Do we want rugby league kind of scrums, or do we want to go back to old school scrumming like the days of Colin Mees and Brian Lahore in New Zealand and all these famous All Blacks who loved getting into the scrums and doing their work during a rugby game? Those days seem to be long gone. So this is an area of the game that I think needs a lot of work. The scrums at the Rugby World Cup were a bit of a joke, and I would like to see something done with the scrums. I think it's an absolute eyesore at the moment, and I think too much time in the game is taking up with the process around the scrums. Never used to happen in the old days. The scrums were put down quickly, the ball was really pushed for, and away we went. We saw some rugby develop from there, but it just seems to have lost its way in the recent years. And I put the question out there, do we want to see rugby league style scrums, or do we want to go back to old school rugby scrumming? Let me know in the comments. Really interested in hearing your views on this one. Okay, next one on my list for bad things that are happening in global rugby at the moment. I don't want to spend too much time on this. This topic's been talked to death. It's the Rugby World Cup draw. It's got to be fixed for 2027. I'm sure it's going to be. But what we saw in France was a bit of a joke. We didn't like it. We made our points very, very clear. Let's move on. Let's fix it and make sure it doesn't happen again in Australia in 2027. Let's fix the World Cup draws, make sure we've got the best teams playing against each other at the end of the tournament. Okay, two more things on my list of bad things as far as the global state of rugby today. The first one is investment in the game across the board. We've got to see World Rugby be more transparent, and we've got to see World Rugby making more money. The game's got to grow. 1.1 billion views across the world during this year's Rugby World Cup. We've got to turn that into dollars. We've got to make sure the business model is right, and we've got to see that huge team that World Rugby has. And I've been onto their website and I've looked at all the positions that are currently under use in World Rugby in that organisation at the moment. We need to see those people being accountable for the growth of the game across the world. And I'm an ex-corporate business guy, so it's one of the first things I look at, and I think World Rugby could be doing a much better job at growing the game. I think with that amount of viewership, the momentum they've got from the Rugby World Cup, they've got to get out there. They've got to get some huge global partners on board that want to invest in the game and take the game to the next level. And we've got to make sure that money, that revenue that's coming in from World Rugby trickles down into the right areas. We've got to see the likes, for instance, of the Pacific nations being given the opportunity to grow the game, because we've got some of the best athletes in the world, men and women, in that part of the world. And we saw what happened with Fiji at this year's Rugby World Cup, because they had an opportunity for the Drua team to play in that Super Rugby and down under this year, and it's really made a difference. So we need to pile some money into Samoa and Tonga as well. We need to make sure the structure's right for the game to grow in those countries. We've got to get rid of the corruption that's happening in those countries as well. And that's the way we're going to grow the game of rugby. So as you can see, I'm very passionate about this. I want to see the game of rugby growing around the world, and I want to make sure that we've got the people sitting in the right positions to make that happen. The investment in the game needs to be now. We need to see it happening right from the young grassroots level right up to the professional game, and we need to see it happening in the South Pacific, because that's where we've got a great opportunity, as well as Eastern Europe. And we've seen with teams like Romania and Georgia and Portugal as well in Western Europe, we've seen these teams that have got fantastic opportunities if the investment's going to be made there. And we need to see the investment in a dollar sense, but we also need to see the investment coming from them joining higher tier competitions so that they can get opportunities to grow the state of their game and the competition level of the game in their respective country. So investment used wisely in the right areas is absolutely paramount to get the game of rugby growing around the world, in my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments. What ideas have you got? What solutions need to be put in place? And have we got the right people running World Rugby today? Now, last one on my list today for bad things that are happening in the global rugby community at the moment, and it is the state of rugby in Australia. And I've seen a lot of your comments over the last few weeks, whether it be talking about Eddie Jones or Australia's performance at the Rugby World Cup, and I think we all agree we don't want to see Australia at the level of rugby they're playing at the moment. They got kicked out of the Rugby World Cup in the pool stages, the first time that's happened in the history of that nation, and we don't want to see that. We want to see a strong Australian rugby nation. They're a very proud nation. They were very, very good at rugby. They've won a World Cup, and we want to see more competition in the state of Australian rugby. So there's a big call at the moment for Hamish McLennan to be fired in Australian rugby. There's been a number of people coming out in the last 24 to 48 hours saying that he has to resign and move on. We need to see a new set of ideas and management coming into Australian rugby, and I think that's one of the things that hits my list today of bad things that's happening in global rugby. We need to see a strong Australia in World Rugby. It's good for everybody in the game, and Australia needs to clean up their act, and we need to come together to help them do that with ideas and innovation. But again, it comes down to the people running the game in that country, and that's something that I think is happening right at this very moment. There's questions being asked, and we need to see if changes are going to be made, because I think that's going to be a good thing for Australian rugby. So if you're an Aussie rugby fan, let me know in the comments below, what do you think has to happen in Australia? And if you're a global rugby fan, are you in agreement with me? We need to see a strong Australia on the rugby global stage, because it's important for the game across the world. Okay, we're moving on to the list of ugly things that are happening in global rugby today. And you'll probably be pleased to know I've only got 3 things on this list, but they're all pretty serious things as far as I'm concerned. The first one was the situation around Wayne Barnes and what happened to him and his family post Rugby World Cup this year. And I don't want to just focus on Wayne Barnes, because the rugby landscape at a global level, referees who are giving up their time and their lives to go and administer this game for us on the field every weekend are being abused, and it's not acceptable. What happened to Wayne Barnes and his family with death threats from people online is absolutely ugly. It has to stop, and those people need to be held accountable for. We see this too much in today's world with keyboard warriors thinking that they're strong and they're tough behind their keyboards. I get it here on this channel, and I'm a nobody. So imagine what someone like a Wayne Barnes has to put up with on social media. Now, a lot of people say, well, Wayne Barnes should get off social media if he doesn't want to be held accountable for. Well, if you actually look at the reason why Wayne Barnes is on social media, he does a lot of charity work, and he uses that platform as a way of communicating those activities that are helping rugby across the world. So of course there's always going to be reasons why people need to be on social media and want to be on social media, and should be able to be on social media without getting the abuse that they've got. So that's something that I think has been very, very poorly handled, and it's also been very, very poor to see that from the global rugby community about how Wayne Barnes, if you've got an opinion about a player or an official in the game, keep that opinion to yourself, or if you have to share it in a respectful manner and be an adult about it. But we're seeing too many people who are being absolutely abusive, and it's definitely something that needs to be improved. And the next thing on my list when it comes to ugly things that are happening in world rugby today is racism. And again, it's something I've seen firsthand. I come from a country that's very proud with its racial heritage, and I love the Maori people, I love the Polynesian people. I had a lot of those friends playing with me in my rugby teams at school, and we all got on very, very well. But unfortunately in this age we live in, once again around social media, where it's very easy for people to get online and stick their keyboard warriorness in our face, and they become abusive and they become racial as well. And we're seeing it at grounds during games as well. It's unwarranted, and it should be stamped out of our game. And I would propose straight away that if there's any racial abusing happening at grounds around the world, those people need to be removed from the grounds and given a life ban. They shouldn't be allowed back in to watch the great game of rugby again. Now, of course, this is a minority of the population across the rugby community, I'm aware of that, but it also ruins it for a lot of other people. And it's often when the minority do these bad things that it has an impact. Imagine if you're at a game and you're sitting next to somebody that's racially abusing a player or a referee on the field. It's not something that you want to be around or comfortable with, I'm assuming. So that's something that really needs to be stomped out of the game of rugby. Now, another thing that's happening in the world of rugby today, and we saw it quite prevalent throughout the Rugby World Cup in 2023 in France, was the behavior of some of the ex-international players. This was absolutely horrific. And I, for one, want to see ex-players being role models for the younger generation. And people like Justin Marshall, who get out there and they do a fantastic job of being an ambassador for the sport. And there's a lot of others as well. Jean de Villiers, we saw on the South African, Victor Mayfield. There's a lot of really good ones, there's no doubt about it. But we saw, and I'm focusing here on a couple of Australians that we saw during the Rugby World Cup, ex-players who got out there, they got themselves incredibly drunk on the streets of France, and they got in front of a camera and they started being absolute idiots in front of a global audience. And this is something that I think really needs to be cut out, and World Rugby needs to step in and make examples of some of these guys, because I think it's a real disgrace to the game. I don't want to see my young boy or girl watching these people and seeing this kind of behavior from ex-international so-called stars of the game. Again, it's the minority, but we've got to stop it from becoming the majority. And for the most part throughout the Rugby World Cup, I really enjoyed the interaction of the ex-international players across the different countries, but there was a few that really made clowns of themselves, and I think that's a bad look for the game of rugby. And you've only got to go on YouTube and look across some of the podcasts and all the rest of it, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. We don't need hooligans, we don't need yobbos in the game that are just destroying the game for everybody else. Rugby is a game for everyone. It's an inclusive game that's there for men and boys, it's there for women and girls, it's there for all the people that love the game across the world, and we need to set the standards high for the growing population of the game. Otherwise, if people see that, they're going to go and put their kids into another sport, and we're going to lose that opportunity to keep growing the game the way it is. So that's one of the things that I see as a real ugly thing starting to happen in the world of rugby online at the moment. So there we go. As I said, I wanted to make a video today to talk about the global state of our great game of rugby. I looked at the good, the bad and the ugly. Now I'd love to hear from you. So why don't you get in the comments and look at those three segments that I talked about and give me your opinions. Let me know how the game is in your part of the world. I really want to increase my knowledge base when it comes to understanding the games. And if you've got some topics that I never covered, which I'm sure you have, in the good, the bad and the ugly, let me know what they are, and maybe I'll make another video and we'll talk about those as well. I've been trying to get people from World Rugby to come on my show and interview them and talk about the state of the game. I've got no reply so far to my messages that I send out. I'm going to keep trying because I want to talk to those people, and we want to hear some of the answers to the questions that we've all got about the state of rugby. So if you've got a question that you'd like to ask someone in the World Rugby Organisation about the state of the game, drop it in the comments and I'll add it to my list, so when I do actually get someone on my show, I'll be able to ask them that particular question. Okay, that's it for this particular video. If you haven't seen my most recent video about Scott Robertson, the new All Black coach, why don't you go and check that one out? That's a good one as well. Plenty of comments coming through on Scott Robertson's future as the All Black coach, so I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on that one as well. I'm going to be back again soon with some more content here on Inside Rugby with Mark. Until then, everybody, stay safe, stay well, keep enjoying your rugby across the world, and I'll see you again really soon. Until then, bye for now.